Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to talk about novels that are written in diary form. So I got the idea for this video because 3 of the books that I've been reading this month all have aspects of diary writing in them. Either whole sections of it are diary or diary style letters and things like that. And that just made me think about the diary as a literary device. So today I just want to talk about a few books that use diary form, either for the whole novel or just as a part of it. Now, you'll all be familiar with some books that are famously diaries, and you know that because they have diary right in the title, like Bridget Jones's Diary or The Secret Diary of Adrian and things like that. There are other books that kind of use aspects of diary writing in an epistolary novel where really the writing is supposed to be letters, but because the letters only go one way, it feels a lot like a diary. For example, in The Colour Purple by Alice Walker, the main character technically writes letters to God, letters to her sister, letters to all sorts of people, but very rarely does she get a reply. And therefore, reading the writing feels a lot like reading a diary, even though you're technically reading a letter. Another book that is a bit like that, and one of the books that gave me the idea for this video, is Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. The whole book is technically a long letter from a man to his son, but again, it's a lot more a personal journal than an actual letter to someone. However, today I want to talk about 4 books that have got traditional aspects of diary writing in them and use them as a literary device. Now, it's a very interesting and at the same time a very obvious way of telling a story, isn't it? Because in a diary you always have the immediate reaction to anything, the first thoughts, the kind of very intimate way of looking at one's life. And if you have a good enough character, that can really bring a story to life. And all 4 of my examples, all of these books that really, they are recommendations. You should go and read them if you haven't. What makes them so interesting is that the main character's writing in their diary is gripping enough that we are interested in their thoughts about things that are going on in their lives. I've sorted this list chronologically by publication date because I couldn't be bothered to think of a better way of actually organising this list. So let's start with the earliest book that I want to talk about, and that is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. This is a novel from 1719, so this is 300 years ago, and it's mostly a first-person narrative in which Robinson Crusoe talks about his decades on a abandoned remote island where he ended up shipwrecked with everyone else dead and him the sole survivor of this shipwreck, and how he is surviving in the wild, how he's building a new life all by himself. However, there are some chapters in this that are excerpts from his diary because luckily he ended up shipwrecked with some ink and some paper, although he does mention that it is a limited amount of ink and paper, and in all of his decades on this island he didn't figure out how to create ink and paper from the materials on the island. So it's not a surprise really that the diary entries are pretty short. I'll read you an example. September the 30th, 1659. I, poor miserable Robinson Crusoe, being shipwrecked during a dreadful storm in the offing, came on shore on this dismal, unfortunate island, which I called the Island of Despair, all the rest of the ship's company being drowned, and myself almost dead. All the rest of the day I spent in afflicting myself at the dismal circumstances I was brought to. I had neither food, house, clothes, weapon, nor place to fly to, and in despair of any relief saw nothing but death before me. So this diary continues throughout the first few years of Robinson Crusoe's stay on the island, and I think it's a really interesting insight into someone who's very lonely and someone who is trying his hardest to keep normality. So he keeps the diary partly so he doesn't forget what day it is, what year it is, so he doesn't forget his duties as a Christian, and so he doesn't forget his language really, because being all by himself he has no one to talk to, so writing becomes his way of communicating with no one, obviously, with no one in particular, but communicating nonetheless. So the diary is a really interesting section of this book, and one that took me by surprise. I just didn't expect a diary to show up in an 18th century novel. Now, not all of the diary entries are as emotional as that first one that I read to you, for example. There are a few that I'm just going to read out to you in sequence. December the 24th, much rain all night and day, no stirring out. December the 25th, rain all day. December the 26th, no rain, and the earth much cooler than before, and pleasanter. When you got nothing else to talk about, you talk about the weather. The next example is possibly my favourite example of a diary-style narration, because the diary writer is such a fascinating person. And I'm talking about Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall from 1848. This book is split in two narration styles. At the beginning and at the end of the novel, you have a male narrator who is writing a letter. And then in the middle, you have a female narrator who's writing in her diary. And she really is the main character of the book. She is the tenant of Wildfell Hall. And the middle part is much longer than the outer two, the framing parts, really. This woman, whom we know as Mrs. Graham at the beginning of the book, writes to her diary quite infrequently. Often there is just 1 or 2 entries per year, and the story is told over several years. In her diary, she recounts, I'm trying really hard not to spoiler anything here, she recounts her youth, and then her kind of courtship with a certain man, and then their marriage. Now the marriage, and I can pretty much tell this now because it's not just such a big spoiler, marriage doesn't go well. So all of the problems that she has with her husband, she pours into the diary. All of the pain she goes through, all of the frustration, all of the anger, but also all of the love and all of the heartbreak she pours into this diary. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall reads like a very modern book, despite being written in the 1840s, because of this direct emotional writing. She's speaking to you as the reader directly, and she's pouring her heart out. That is what makes it such an amazing book, and my favourite Bronte novel. Sorry, Jane Eyre. But this very direct connection that you have with the main character, you only get through these diary entries. Another interesting plot point about the diary in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, that as well as being a medium of communicating the story to the reader, the diary itself becomes part of the plot, and that takes place in the framing narrative. So while the diary itself is the narration during the middle part of the book, at the end it also becomes a plot device, and I think that's just quite cleverly done. It gives the diary a purpose that goes beyond just the medium through which the story is told. Then for the next book, we are jumping ahead 100 years to 1948, which is the publication year of Dodie Smith's I Capture the Castle. This is my favourite novel that is told entirely in diary form. I Capture the Castle is the diary of a 17-year-old girl named Cassandra, and she writes this diary very consciously to be read, I think. She does that thing that we all do when we write a diary, and I used to write a diary pretty religiously between the ages of 8 and 15. And you write your innermost thoughts, you write, it's a very intimate experience, but at the same time you're thinking, when I'm long dead and someone finds this diary, I want this to be good enough to be published. And I think that is what Cassandra is doing. Partly she's influenced by her father being an author, so she does have some literary ambitions, but at the same time she just wants to write in a very entertaining way. And her aim is to capture her life, to capture the castle, which is the ruin that she lives in with her eccentric bohemian family, to capture the members of her family themselves, her weird author father and his weird wife and her weird sister, and they're all very eccentric characters, and she tries and capture them in this diary. This book takes place, I believe, over just half a year or so. So it is, in a way, it's a very realistic diary. You know, there are bits where she doesn't write because she had other things to do. The diary entries are all very long and they kind of recapture what happened in the past week. It's such a fun book. It makes you nostalgic for a past that was never yours, because I've never been a 17-year-old girl in 1930s England. But this book makes me feel like I was, and again, that is entirely down to the very direct form of narrating a story, because even more so than in a traditional first-person narration, through a diary you get the story in the very words of the main character. Cassandra in I Capture the Castle is a hilarious and wonderful girl whose thoughts you are interested in. And it's just lucky for all of us that she wrote them down in a journal. The last book I want to talk about today is my most recent diary read, and that is The Children of Men by P.D. James. And this is a book from 1992. However, it is set in 2021. This is a dystopian novel that is set in a world where people have stopped having children. Everyone has suddenly gone infertile. The population of the world is aging and a totalitarian government is trying to keep the few people that are left on Earth happy and healthy. Our main character and diary writer is Dr. Theodore Farron, who's an Oxford professor of history. And the book starts with his diary, a diary that he bought on the 1st of January in 2021, and that he wants to recount his life in. Although he notes in the very first diary entry that he's not quite sure who he's writing this for, because there won't be many people still left when he dies. You know, him being a middle-aged man in a society where the youngest members are in their 20s. And this is a fantastic book. I've heard it's quite different to the film. I've not seen the film myself, but the book itself is great. It's my kind of dystopia, you know, it's very technical. There's a lot of talk about politics and society. There's a bit of action at the end, but it's not a kind of fast-paced, heavy on the plot kind of book. It's more a slow, philosophical, what-if kind of a book. I really enjoyed this book, but this is one example where I think the diary writing could have been put to better use. A lot of the time in The Children of Men, the diary entries, which don't make up the whole of the book, the diary entries are kind of interspersed into the narrative, where there are blocks of chapters that are all parts of the diary, and then there's a few chapters that are normal third-person narration. I think the author could have used the diary better. Either making the entire novel a diary, which I don't see why she couldn't have done that, because the entire novel is centered on Theo and his life, so there's no reason why she couldn't have done that. Or just leave it out altogether. And so this is one where there's a slight disconnect between the third-person narration and the diary entries, and I can't quite see the value of including the diary. The diary bits, they're not bad. They're just a bit pointless. Anyway, I wanted to include this novel in this list because it is a very good novel. I enjoyed it, I would recommend it, and it has some diary writing in it. And this was one of the books that gave me the idea to this video because I read it this month. So let me know, which novels do you enjoy that have got diary bits in them? Or which novels do you enjoy that are all made up of diary entries? Let me know in the comments. Oh, okay. I need to point something out before I finish this video. I looked up diary style books while planning this video because I wanted to make sure that I don't leave any out that I've read and enjoyed. And I found a list on Goodreads that's called something like the best diary novels. And right at the top of the list is Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl. I'm sure you all know this, but it is shocking to see that book on a list of diary style novels. Because it's not a novel. The whole point of the book is that it's true, that it's real, that it's a real diary. It's not a fictional story. And it should not belong on a list of diary-style novels. I'm sure you all know that. I wish there was a way of removing a book from a list because it was quite shocking and made me quite angry to see Anne Frank's book on a list of novels. On that downer, thank you for watching. Goodbye.